I got curious and wondered if the heretical dungeon practices what it preaches. First, I think we should clear up what a pit really is before we go around looking for them. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines pit as a noun, meaning either a hole, shaft, or cavity in the ground, or an area often sunken or depressed below the adjacent floor area. Keeping this in mind, let's cast out the definitions and jump straight into the first dilemma. Does launching the Pit of Heresy count as a pit? Because you can technically make the argument that by loading up the dungeon, you are entering a pit. On the other hand, everyone knows that when you load into the dungeon, you're standing at the entrance to the Scarlet Keep in Sorrow's Harbor, which is definitely not a pit, therefore the dilemma. Looking at this logically, I would have to not count the action of loading into the dungeon as a pit, only due to the fact that you don't truly enter the dungeon until you jump on top of a chained off, glowing green, impenetrable plate of ground and magically make it disappear. This is without a doubt a pit. It's literally a hole, a shaft, and a cavity in the ground that is sunken below the adjacent floor area. I would also like to add that this pit is enclosed on all sides until you hit the bottom, which is a self-imposed rule I put in place, because is it really a pit if it just leads out to the world? Without being enclosed, it's almost like you're just going down a steep hill into a field. Now, I don't care how long the enclosure lasts, as evident by the second pit I counted. This pit could just be classified as a drop down since you do technically do that, but you also drop down into pits, so that invalidates that as an argument. Besides, it's very fitting that the entrance to the dungeon Pit of Heresy is chock full of pits, and it does have a full connected ring around it to fill the enclosed criteria. Down at the bottom of this second pit, we do have another dilemma. What do we classify these green things as? Although they do technically fit all the criteria for a pit, I don't think that's the most fitting description. A crevice is described as a narrow opening resulting from a split or a crack, which I think is a far more accurate definition as far as these green little things are concerned. If you wanted to go another step further, you could also call them fissures, which is basically just a bigger and longer crevice, which I'm sure these little guys wish they were. Moving through the entrance, we have 2 more pits and a couple more crevices to get through, then it's out to the first encounter, which takes place in probably the second most impressive pit in the game. The first has to be this one, the pit way down in the moon that you fight the Nightmare of Fogotham. The location is aptly called the Summoning Pits, but that's beside the point. Let's go back to Pit of Heresy. The pit that the first encounter is in is huge, like massive. It's certainly the main pit of the dungeon, and it looks like it. The massive hole in the sky letting in light is one of the features confirming this stunning cave as a pit. The entrance the player comes out of is also an opening to the pit, just confirming it even more. Although you don't really need any technical speech to confirm this area as a pit, you can just use your eyes. Getting back into the nitty-gritty of it, let's talk about the first encounter. Although there aren't any more super obvious pits like the big one we're standing in, there are 22 other discrepancies we can talk about. Starting off with these bad boys. There are 17 of these buildings scattered around the encounter, and all but one of them have a tiny circular hole in their roof, so 16 arguments for pits. Do we count them? On one hand, they are literally in the ceilings of all these buildings, and how can you have a pit that goes upwards? On the other hand, due to the verticality of the encounter, it's easy to consider these pits because you drop onto the majority of the buildings and sometimes even through the hole in the roof. To top it all off, it even fits the criteria of being enclosed on all sides. So do we call it a pit? No. I mean, I've literally said it twice. These are considered holes in the roofs of the buildings. Maybe very rarely someone will say something like, yo, drop through the pit in the roof. No, just saying that felt weird. They aren't pits. For the remaining 6 candidates in this encounter, I have to introduce a new rule/definition of the word pit. Also in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, there is a sub-definition of pit that goes as follows. An enclosure in which animals are made to fight each other. Enclosure and animals don't really help our case, but a pit to fight in, almost like a ring, does. Inside of each of the buildings marked by symbols, there are rooms you can go into. And inside of those rooms, there is a slightly sunken part of the floor with an enemy sitting in it. To me, there is no doubt in my mind that these count as pits. So add another 6 to the counter and let's move on. We aren't moving very far though, because the next pit comes right as you walk through the door that opens after completion of the second encounter. If you look to your left and your right, you'll notice that the path on which you're standing is actually a platform hovering above a seemingly bottomless pit. This pit extends all the way over to the wall of doors that houses the entrance to the next encounter, although it's not as bottomless over here as it is under the platform. Regardless, I still count it all as one because there's no clear boundary separating under the platform pit from under the doors pit. Once you're through the wall of doors and on the way through the tunnel that leads to the second encounter, there is only one more pit that you have to drop down through to begin the ogre maze. not much else to say about this one. Okay, inside the second encounter, I think there are 3 to 4 pits. The first is the obvious one. Over along the left pathway, you look out over the ridge into a glowing green pit with a massive skeleton sitting at the bottom. If you look close enough, you can even see the little platforms that fly up when progressing the Xenophage quest. The second pit in this encounter is a bit harder to find. If you take this entrance into the tunnel system through this encounter, then follow that until you hit this suspicious pile of rocks, you can jump over that into a pit. At the bottom of that pit, there's a tunnel, and if you continue along this tunnel, you'll end up in a little room with a chest in the middle. Seems harmless enough, right? But if you look up, you'll notice that you're actually in a pit underneath the start to the Xenophage encounter, making this the third pit in the Ogre Maze. Now, the fourth pit is kind of right next door. It's the actual Xenophage encounter. The boss flies around a room that is a pit. It's sunk into the middle of the room with ledges and balconies surrounding it. We'll move the counter up one and let's move along. The third encounter brings another argument to the table. Is the center of the arena a pit? It is lower than all of its surroundings, but also this quote-unquote pit is the main part of the encounter, and everything is elevated around it. It's not sunken below the other ground. I personally feel that the only thing making me question this little patch of ground's identity is the rock in the middle. I feel this rock is trying to trick me into thinking this pit is more elevated than it actually is. So we're counting it as a pit. Moving past third encounter, we have another easy one, the dropper after popping the pimple. It's genuinely just a big pit that you jump into. Once you go through this dropper/pit and survive, you'll notice that there is another section of dropper you can fall through and die. I'm counting this as all part of the same pit because it just doesn't make sense to me to count it as 2 separate pits. Outside of this little room, however, is a very large, very expansive pit that stretches all the way out across the whole encounter and seemingly beyond, plus has no bottom. This is the easiest +1 to the counter yet. Nothing else in the fourth encounter strikes me as a pit until you walk through the door after killing all 3 wizards. After opening the door, you walk onto a narrow bridge that casts you out into a large room. Although this room does technically fit all of our criteria for a pit, it is literally just a room. And famously, you don't refer to a ballroom or a big grand hallway as a pit. However, after you drop down into the room, you'll notice that much like the transition between first and second encounter, there is nothing under the floor you're standing on except for a bottomless pit. Continuing this trend, you can walk through the greenish hallway to find the same thing out on the other side. Just a platform floating above pit. Since you're probably curious, it would be helpful to include that this pit after the hallway does not connect to the pit surrounding Zolmak and is instead blocked off by a large stone wall. Speaking of Zolmak, I don't think there are any new pits in this encounter. Sure, there are a lot of things to argue for, but nothing definite. The first pit candidate I should get out of the way is the obvious one. All the area surrounding the floating hive arena you fight Zolmak on. Although, yes, this is clearly a pit. We already counted it at the beginning of the video when we entered into the first encounter, since first and fifth encounters share the same space. The second argument is technically the next 3 arguments since it concerns all 3 of the buildings. I know we already stated that the holes in the roofs don't count as pits, but the holes in these roofs are clogged up by hive chandeliers, making them technically have a bottom. I'm still not going to count these because you wouldn't describe them as pits, just clogged holes in ceilings. And lastly, the arena in which you fight Zolmak. Although it is the closest thing to an enclosure that exists in a fighting pit in this dungeon, I don't think it should count as a pit because it's elevated above the ground. If you were to walk into it, you would have to climb steps. Thus, unfortunately, the final battle of Pit of Heresy does not take place within a pit. An arena for sure. You could even call it a ring, but it's not quite a pit. And that concludes the final tally on how many pits are in Pit of Heresy. The total ended up being 22 pits, which is honestly pretty solid, better than I thought going into this. Congratulations to the devs who cooked this one up for staying on theme with the name and delivering one of the best pieces of content in the game. With all that said, thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch another video, click one of these videos that should have just appeared on the side of the screen. It's mostly quality content. If you did end up enjoying this video, consider subscribing. I'm posting a video a week for the foreseeable future and I have some fun ideas and surprises planned. So if that's something you'd be interested in, press the subscribe button. Or if you aren't that into commitment, like me, you can always press the like button instead. Commenting works too if you want to let me know how many pits I missed or how incorrect and unfactual my video was or how I'm a bad entertainer. Regardless, thank you for watching and I will see you next week.